In the autumn of 1883, in the high desert county of Callaway, New Mexico Territory, there existed a place called Harlan that most men had already decided was finished. The town had been platted in 1867, had briefly held a post office and a dry goods concern and a livery of modest reputation, and had emptied itself out over the course of 15 years with the slow, grinding efficiency of a place that simply refused to be enough. The silver had not materialized. The railroad had curved 20 miles to the south. The families who had arrived with trunks and intentions had departed with much less. By the time the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe attempted to settle the outstanding claims on Harlan's platted lots, they found 4 heirs who would not speak to one another, a dispute that had outlasted 2 county clerks and 1 traveling judge, and a docket that had grown so tangled with liens and counterliens and disputed surveys that the senior clerk, a man named Potts, had taken to simply setting the Harlan folder on the very bottom of each day's pile and letting it rest there. Harlan was the kind of problem that bureaucracies solve by ceasing to look at it directly. Into this situation arrived Nora Vass, age 27, with a flat iron in her bag, a pair of fine scissors in a leather roll, and $11 remaining to her name. She had come from Albuquerque, where she had spent 3 years as the head alterations hand at a dry goods house on Gold Avenue, and before that from her mother's kitchen in Belen, where she had learned to sew the way some children learn language, not from instruction, but from proximity and repetition. She had watched her mother Dora work a seam flat before pressing it, had understood at 9 years old that fabric has a grain, and that working against the grain always costs you in the end. Her mother had said this about cloth, but she had also said it about people, about land, about the whole stubborn world that resisted being worked from the wrong direction. Her mother had been a precise and unhurried woman who had made good things from difficult material for 51 years, and who had died in the spring of 1883 from a fever that had come and gone quickly, leaving Nora with a house that was not hers, a grave on a hill, and the leather roll of scissors that Dora had kept sharp her entire life. The dry goods house had failed in August. The owner, a man named Hennessy, had overextended on a spring order and the summer collection had not moved, and he had closed the shop with 2 weeks' notice and a small severance that left Nora with enough money to not be desperate for a short time, and not enough money to establish herself in a city where workrooms and shop space and the goodwill of established trade were all already spoken for. She was not without skill. She was without a room in which to apply it. The Harlan matter came to her attention on a Wednesday by way of a notice tacked to the courthouse door in the county seat of Callaway. The Territorial Land Office, in its determination to settle the Harlan question before the calendar turned, had authorized an auction of the disputed lots as an undivided whole, the legal title to be held in trust until the inheritance matter was adjudicated, the buyer to have occupancy rights only pending resolution. The opening bid had been set at $9, which the notice characterized as the value of the salvageable lumber. There was a note at the bottom, in a different hand from the main text, that said the property included 1 2-story frame structure at the foot of Main Street, approximately 1,800 square feet, south-facing windows, and that access could be arranged with the land office prior to bidding. She read the notice twice, then walked to the land office and asked about the south-facing windows. The men at the auction the following morning did not take Nora seriously. There were 4 of them, speculators mostly, and one was the son of a rancher with grazing interests in the surrounding hills, who had come primarily to ensure the whole of Harlan did not pass into the hands of some enterprise that would complicate his father's fence lines. They had among them a fair amount of money and the shared certainty that a young woman arriving on foot from the county seat, dressed in a brown wool traveling jacket and carrying a canvas bag, was either lost or confused or both. She bid $9. One of the speculators bid $11. She bid $12. The rancher's son had already shaken his head and walked away, his interest satisfied by the modest scale of the proceedings. The remaining speculators conferred briefly and then declined, either because the arithmetic of a disputed title made the investment genuinely poor, or because there was something in Nora's posture, in the way she stood and watched the auctioneer with her hands settled quiet at her sides, that made a prolonged contest feel unwise. The auctioneer, a man named Gruber who had conducted a great many distressing transactions in his career, knocked the gavel down at $12.50 and told her she now owned, in an occupancy sense only, the complete platted footprint of Harlan, New Mexico territory, comprising 14 lots, one derelict main street, and a heritage of legal unpleasantness he wished her luck with. The men behind her laughed. One said something about a lady mayor. Another said she would need more than a needle and thread to fix what ailed Harlan. Gruber himself said nothing but watched her pay with an expression of careful neutrality. She did not look back at the men. She paid Gruber, folded the receipt carefully along its printed lines, and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, close to her chest. What drew her to the town was not sentiment and not optimism. She had not pictured a future in which Harlan rose again, or in which she presided over its restoration, or became the kind of woman people wrote letters about. What she had seen, in the land office notice, was a building. A 2-story frame structure with south-facing windows was, to a seamstress without a workroom, a specific and practical thing that had nothing to do with romance or ambition. The disputed title was an inconvenience she had decided to defer. She could work under a disputed title. She could not work without light. She arrived in Harlan on a Thursday. The road south from the county seat took her through 6 miles of scrub and alkali flat, the terrain broken only by occasional dry washes and stands of chala cactus, and the occasional bleached scatter of bones that the desert left as a matter of course in places where water was not reliable. It was a cold morning, the kind of dry desert cold that has no moisture in it, and so does not feel wet on the skin but presses through clothing in a more fundamental way. She walked at a steady pace with her bag in one hand and the leather roll looped over the opposite shoulder, and the town emerged from the distance, not with the sudden drama of the canyon country to the west, but with a kind of quiet resignation, the buildings visible first as a gray-brown smudge on the horizon that resolved as she walked into structures leaning at various angles in the thin, high desert light. The main street was a single block. There had been, at some point, a hardware concern with a collapsed false front, a barber shop barely larger than a closet, a rooming house with a wooden second-floor porch now half collapsed, its railing dangling at a 30-degree angle over the street. At the far end stood what appeared to have been a livery, its double doors open, the iron hinges too rusted to permit closing. Between these structures, the street itself had reverted to desert at the margins, sagebrush finding its way through the packed earth in 2 or 3 places where the wagon traffic had once kept it clear. The mercantile building at the foot of the street was the largest and had been, in its time, the most substantial. 2 stories of frame construction, pine board and batten siding, weathered to silver gray. The grain of the old wood raised by years of wind and temperature until the surface had a texture like the back of a hand. The storefront windows were boarded from outside with planks that had shrunk in the dry air, and now admitted thin blades of afternoon light between them, the light catching the motes of dust that moved in the interior dark. She went in through the front door, which was not locked. The latch had long since disengaged from the strike plate. The interior was dry and smelled of old wood and something faintly mineral she could not name, a smell she would later learn was the alkali dust that came through every crack in the floor, no matter how she swept. A wooden counter ran the length of the south wall. Behind it, shelves built to the ceiling, empty of everything except a few cigar tins, a glass jar with a cracked lid, and a bolt of cotton fabric too sun-faded to recover. Its original color somewhere between rose and sand, unrecoverable now. The floor was sound under her feet for most of its length, with one weak board near the north wall that flexed but did not give. The south-facing windows, boarded on the outside, meant she would need to pull the planks to work, but the frames and glass appeared intact. Upstairs, through a door at the back of the main room, she found a landing and two rooms. One had a roof that had held entirely. The plaster ceiling cracked in several places, but the boards above sound. The other room had lost perhaps a third of its roof to what appeared to have been a combination of snow load and rot, and the floor under the gap was warped and soft, and she did not walk far into it. The sound room had two windows, west-facing, with their glass intact, and their frames swollen shut from years of weather, but not broken. She stood in the room with the intact roof for a long time, watching the afternoon light come through a gap in the boards over the west window, a shaft of desert light the color of old honey, moving slowly across the plaster as the sun declined. She slept the first 2 nights on her coat on the floor of the mercantile's ground room, her bag as a pillow, the scissors in the leather roll set within reach by habit. On the third day, she pulled the boards from the south windows. It took her the better part of the morning, working with a pry bar she found in the livery. The nails corroded enough that some came free easily and others required patient leveraging, a slow coaxing rather than a rip. When the last board came down and she stepped back, the south light came into the room with an authority that surprised her, flooding the long counter and the empty shelves and picking out every seam in the old wood floor with a precision that was, in its way, generous. A room that wanted to show you what it was made of. She stood in the middle of it with the bar in her hand for a moment before she set it down. In her first week, she found several things she had not expected. The pair of work boots too large for any woman, belonging from their wear pattern to a man who had walked with his weight on the outside of his left foot, set under the counter in the back as though placed there deliberately and then forgotten. She moved them to the corner and did not disturb them further. Someone had worn them long enough for the leather to take the exact impression of his foot. And there was something in that specificity that seemed to belong to the building rather than to her. A glass inkwell, still stoppered, with ink that had reduced to a dark brown paste at the bottom. A set of account ledgers on the shelf at the end of the counter, 3 of them, bound in brown paper and tied with twine that had dried and gone brittle. She noticed on the day she found them that the bindings were stamped in faded but legible ink with the name Harlan Mercantile Company, and below that, Proprietary Ledgers, and below that, a line she read twice and then a third time before she set the ledgers back. Not for Land Office Review. In the cellar, reached by a trapdoor behind the counter that she almost did not open, because the iron ring pull had corroded to a dull opacity against the floorboards, she found 3 bolt ends of wool serge in dark gray, wrapped in oilcloth that had themselves been bound in canvas sacking. They were in better condition than anything else in the building. The consistent temperature of the cellar and the dark had kept the color true and the fiber sound, and when she unrolled the first bolt end a 1.5 feet and held it in the light of her lamp, the cloth lay flat without distortion. She brought all 3 bolt ends upstairs and set them along the north wall where they would stay out of the sun until she needed them. She set them on the counter and left them there because she was occupied with making the building habitable, and her time was not unlimited. She found a sound chair in the rooming house across the street. She cut a length of the serge she had found in the cellar, a discovery of 3 bolt ends of dark gray wool in reasonable condition, protected from the sun by the cool dark of the underground room, and made a curtain for the landing window against the cold nights. She fired the camp stove and heated water and cleaned the south windows with a cloth and the water until they threw light without distortion. She was working methodically and without ceremony, and the work had its own orderly satisfaction, and she deferred the ledgers because she did not yet know what they were, and because she had learned from her mother that some things benefit from being approached when you have the time to finish what you start. She opened the first ledger on the 7th morning. The handwriting was fine and regular, small and upright, the work of a man trained in a careful mercantile hand. The entries ran from 1869 to 1872 and were, on their surface, the ordinary records of a going concern. Goods received, goods sold, credit extended to named customers, debts collected over time. She was not trained as an accountant, but she had worked 3 years in a dry goods operation, and she understood the shape of a business record. She read the first ledger in its entirety, sitting at the counter in the south light with a cup of water at her elbow, and when she was done she set it aside and thought for a moment about what she had read, and then she opened the second. The second ledger covered 1872 to 1875 and was different in a way she could feel before she could fully name. The format was the same careful hand, but the numbers in the accounts receivable column moved in a direction that did not match the narrative the entries supplied. She had her mother's sense for the grain of a thing, for feeling where the work was going against its nature, and she followed that sense the way she followed it in cloth, by slowing down and looking more carefully at the line where the problem began. She turned back to the first page of the second ledger and began again, this time tracking only one family at a time, following the folk account across every quarter of the ledger's span. The balance owed grew steadily, not in the large increases that would mark new goods taken on credit, but in small, consistent increments that matched no purchase entry she could find. She checked the credit column, where purchases would be logged. She checked the payment column, where cash received would reduce the balance. The credit entries were sparse, which made sense for a family that had already established their household and needed less from the mercantile as the years went on. The payment column showed regular entries, amounts that seemed proportionate to what a family working a town lot would manage. 25 cents one quarter, and 40 cents another, and $1 in a good season. The balance did not go down. She sat with this for a long time, her finger on the column, not pressing but resting, the way her mother had rested a hand on cloth to feel its weight before cutting. The accounts receivable section showed debts from 5 named parties. Those debts grew each quarter, not because new goods had been extended on credit, but because interest had been added to the prior balance. The interest rate was not consistent. It appeared to change without explanation or agreement, sometimes doubling between quarters, sometimes holding for a period and then jumping, the variations bearing no relationship to any condition of trade she could identify. She turned pages slowly, tracking one name at a time. A man named Folke, and a man named Arca, and a family called Madison, and a man called Briggs, and a woman which was notable in itself for a mercantile debt ledger named Varro. She turned to the third ledger. The third ledger ran from 1875 to 1879. She had been sitting with the first two for over an hour before she opened it, and the light had shifted south and east, the morning quality of it gone, and the harder midday light in its place. She pulled the curtain she had hung to angle the light from the counter and opened the third ledger and read. The first entries of the third ledger concerned transactions she came to recognize, slowly and then with absolute certainty, as the mechanism by which 5 families had lost their lots. The proprietor of the Harlan Mercantile Company had been a man named Edmund Sayers. He had extended credit to 5 settler families in the lean years of 1872 and 1873. credit the families had accepted in good faith and worked to repay. The repayments were in the ledger. She could see them, the amounts and the dates, but they appeared not in the column that ran forward to determine the balance, but in a secondary column, hand-ruled in a slightly different ink, that she understood after long and careful study to have been added after the fact. The original accounting column showed only the accumulating interest, the payments never deducted from what was owed, as though they had been received by one hand and passed to another before the ledger was opened. The effect across the years of the second and third ledgers taken together was that 5 families owed debts that their own careful records would have shown as repaid in full or nearly so, while Sayers's primary ledger showed them delinquent and in default. When the families left Harlan, some by choice and some under a pressure that the ledgers, read carefully, allowed her to estimate, they had left behind lots whose titles had been transferred to the Harlan Mercantile Company through the county recorder's office in settlement of debts that had never existed in the form recorded. She sat with this for a long time. Outside, the desert wind moved through the open south windows and set the curtain she had made lifting and settling at the edge of her vision. The 3 ledgers lay flat on the counter before her, the third open to its final pages. The 5 names were Amos and Harriet Folk, who had held the lot at the north end of Main Street; Jerome Arca, who had held the hardware concern; the Madison family, 3 adults by the signature block, who had held the rooming house across the street from where she sat; a man named Cole Briggs, who had held the livery at the end of the block; and the woman, Celeste Varro, whose lot description identified the corner parcel south of the Mercantile, the one with the old fence post still visible from Nora's south window. She closed the third ledger and held it with both hands for a moment, the way her mother had held difficult fabric before cutting into it, not to feel its weight but to settle herself. Then she wrapped all 3 in the piece of linen she kept around her flat iron and tied them with a length of thread from her kit. The clerk of court in the county seat was a woman named Addie Holt, and Nora found her on the following Tuesday morning. She set the wrapped ledgers on Addie Holt's counter and unwrapped them with care, as though unwrapping something that might be damaged by carelessness, and then she explained what she had found. She showed Addie Holt the secondary column, and she showed her the ink difference, visible to the naked eye when you knew to look. And she explained the mechanism plainly, in the sequential order in which she had understood it, each step following the one before it without embellishment. Addie Holt was not a quick woman, but she was a thorough one, and she had been the clerk of court long enough to have seen the shape of a fraudulent instrument even when it came to her in the form of a dry goods ledger. She examined what Nora showed her twice through, asking twice to have the secondary column pointed out again, comparing the ink variation in the fading afternoon light. Then she said she would need to speak with the county attorney. The county attorney's name was Warren Fitch, and he received Nora 2 days later, on a Thursday morning, in a room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper. He had questions. He asked about the provenance of the ledgers, how they had come to be in the Mercantile building, whether they might have been placed there after the fact. He asked what she had done with the building in the 2 weeks since the auction, whether anything she had touched or moved could have compromised the evidentiary value of what she was presenting. He asked whether she had any personal interest in the resolution of the Harlan lot dispute. She answered each question directly. She had not altered anything in the ledgers. She had found them on the shelf above the counter and had moved them to the countertop to read them in better light. She had touched them with clean hands and replaced them on the shelf afterward and kept them from the weather. She had, she said, a $12.50 occupancy certificate for the Mercantile building, which was one of the 14 lots, and she intended to use the building as a workroom and had no interest in any of the other lots beyond what the legal resolution of their titles might mean for the clarity of her own situation. Warren Fitch looked at her steadily for a moment. Then he looked back at the ledgers. The forensic examination of the ledgers was conducted over the following 3 weeks by a document examiner engaged from Albuquerque, a methodical man who worked with acid tests and a magnifying glass, and took longer than anyone expected. His written conclusion was that the secondary column had been inscribed after the primary entries were made, that the ink of the secondary column came from a different formulation than the ink in the primary ledger body, and that the paper at the secondary column's ruled line showed differential aging consistent with being added at a later date. This was, as Fitch noted in his filing, precisely what the accounting record itself implied when read with sufficient care. The confirmation converted the matter from contested interpretation to documented fraud. Tracking the heirs of the 5 families required 6 weeks and the assistance of 2 territorial newspapers. Ruth Folke, granddaughter of Amos and Harriet, was found in Las Cruces, employed in a boarding house, a woman of about 30 who had grown up knowing only that her grandparents had gone to New Mexico Territory and come back with nothing and had not spoken of it in any detail for the rest of their lives. Jerome, Arca's son, was found in Tucson. The Madison heirs were located through a letter that ran in both the Santa Fe paper and the Albuquerque Journal. Cole Briggs had died in 1878, and his heir was a sister in Colorado who received the account of what her brother had been owed and then cheated of with a long silence before she replied. Celeste Varro was alive. She was 63 years old, living in a single room in Albuquerque's Old Town District, 3 blocks from the dry goods house where Nora had worked until August. She had come to Harlan in 1871 with her husband, who had died in 1874. She had worked her corner lot as a laundry and pressing operation, taking in work from the men of the town, using 2 large tubs and a line she had strung herself between the corner post and the back of the mercantile's south wall. The pressing was what she was known for. She had a gift for it, for the weight and temperature and the reading of a fabric's nature under the iron. She had worked that lot for 5 years until Sayers had presented her with a dead instrument she could not dispute. And she had left with 1 trunk and a conviction so deep it had calcified into certainty that the world operated against women of limited means by design, that there was no mechanism available to her, no record she could produce or testimony she could offer, that would overturn a man's ledger. She had held that conviction for 7 years when Nora appeared at her door. Nora did not make a speech. She said she had come from Harlan, that she had found something in the mercantile building, and that she thought Celeste Varro should accompany her to the county attorney's office. She did not say what she had found. She did not make promises about what would come of it. She had learned from the county attorney's caution that evidence made its own case when it was presented correctly, and that she was better served by letting the ledgers speak than by arriving with a prepared argument. Celeste Varro looked at her for a long time from her doorway. The doorway was narrow and the room behind her was visible, a room that was tidy and spare. A single window with a clean curtain, a pressed shirt hung on a hook, a small shelf with 4 books and a tin box. She was a woman who had organized what she had with care and without self-pity, and she had the stillness of someone who had been disappointed systematically and had learned to meet everything, first and always, with quiet. She took her coat from its hook. She came. In Warren Fitch's office, she said very little, but she identified her own name in the ledger without prompting, her finger on the entry without trembling, and said that she had paid that amount in the fall of 1874 and that she had the receipt for it, which she had kept in a tin box for 9 years without knowing whether it would ever matter. She brought the tin box from her coat pocket and set it on Fitch's desk and opened it herself, and took out the receipt, which was folded into eighths and slightly soft from years of confinement. She unfolded it and laid it flat on the desk beside the open ledger and did not say anything else. Warren Fitch looked at the receipt and then at the ledger, and then at the receipt again. Then he said he would need to make a copy. She said she would wait. The Territorial Land Office issued its ruling in January of 1884. The mechanism Edmund Sayers had built in his ledgers, as Warren Fitch's filing named it, was found to constitute fraudulent transfer of title in all 5 cases. The titles to the 5 disputed lots were restored to their rightful heirs. The Folk family's north lot to Ruth Folk, the hardware lot to Jerome Arca's son, the rooming house to the Madison heirs, the livery to Cole Briggs's sister, and the corner parcel with its old fence post to Celeste Varro. The Sayers nephew's land agent in Texas made no contest. He had inherited, through the undisputed portions of the Sayers estate, a small amount of legitimately acquired property, and the disputed parcels were, in his calculation, not worth the attorney's fees. There was one question the ruling also settled, which was the status of Nora's own occupancy certificate. The Mercantile Building, the 2-story frame structure with the south-facing windows, had been Edmund Sayers's legitimate property, acquired through lawful purchase in 1867 at Harlan's founding. It had never been among the fraudulently transferred parcels. It had passed to his nephew and thence through the disputed title auction to Nora's $12.50, and the auction, Warren Fitch confirmed, had been legally valid on the Mercantile lot because the Mercantile had a clean title. What she had bought was the one building in Harlan that Sayers had actually earned. She had her workroom. She had known this since October, but it was useful to have it confirmed on paper. She pulled the boards from the south windows properly in the spring of 1884, removing the old planks entirely and replacing them with new hardware she ordered from the county seat, hinged shutters that could be opened in the morning and closed against the afternoon sun. She set up her cutting table along the south wall below the windows, where the light in the early part of the day was level and clear and fell across the table at the angle most useful for reading grain and catching flaws in cloth. She had, by then, 3 clients in the county, women who had heard of the Harlan matter through the usual channels, and who had ridden out to meet the woman who had found what was in the ledgers, and who sewed with what one of them later told another was an entirely unnerving certainty, as though the fabric had no choice but to do what she asked of it. Ruth Folka came to Harlan in the fall of 1884. She came alone on a rented horse, arriving in the late afternoon, and she stood for a long time in the middle of the north lot, where her grandparents' venture had once been. Nora did not try to tell her what to do with it, or what it ought to mean. She made tea on the camp stove and set a chair in the doorway of the Mercantile where the afternoon sun reached the step, and let Ruth stand in the lot for as long as she needed to stand there. When Ruth came to the door finally, she said simply that she had not known what she was going to feel, and that she still did not know entirely. Nora said that seemed right. She handed her the tea. The corner lot that had been Celeste Varro's came alive in the spring of 1885. Celeste had returned to Harlan for one day to arrange for a cottonwood to be planted on the south corner of the lot, in memory of her husband, who had liked cottonwoods along the irrigation ditches of the valley where he had been raised. She managed this through a letter to Nora and a small amount of money for the seedling, and the letter included near the end the statement that she had not expected, in her 63rd year, to hold a piece of land again that was legally and fully her own. She said she had spent 7 years believing that the ordinary systems of record and property had been arranged to be unreadable to women in her position, and that there had been nothing she could do about it. She said she understood now that what she had lacked was not rights, but evidence, and that the evidence had been sitting in a building she had walked past every single day for 5 years without knowing she could read it. Nora folded the letter and placed it inside the third account ledger, between the last page of entries and the backboard. She put Celeste Varro's receipt, the one from the tin box that the woman had kept for 9 years against the possibility of an accounting, in the same ledger. The ledgers stayed where she put them, on the shelf above the cutting table, for the remainder of Nora's working years in that building, which was for the rest of her working life. The 3 brown paper binding, stamped with the faded name of the company whose mechanism they had recorded and then undone, stood in a row above the place where she pressed seams and cut cloth, and answered what the light required of her. She had not made a trophy of them. She had made them part of the room where she worked, because that seemed to her the right proportion. She put the case behind her not with any declaration or ceremony, but by taking on a new client, cutting a pattern, pressing a seam. The work had its own logic, and she followed it. The afternoon light in the workroom was good until well past 3 in the winter months, and lasted longer in the summer. And she learned the room's light the way she had learned her mother's kitchen light, through the slow accumulation of mornings worked in it. The room had its own particular quality in the early hours, a stillness that the desert morning produced before the wind came up, and she found she worked best in that stillness, the scissors making their clean sounds through cloth, the table warm under her hands. The mercantile building stood. The other structures of Harlan declined at their own pace, as abandoned buildings do, neither hastened nor arrested by the resolution of what had been wrong with them. The livery lost its remaining roof boards in a wind in the winter of 1886. The rooming house across the street came down in stages over the following decade, the second-floor porch going first in a particularly cold January, the rest following in the manner of a structure that has decided it has nothing more to hold together for. The hardware concern's false front, already collapsed when Nora arrived, settled further into the scrub. The main street was not a main street in any commercial sense. It was a street on which one person worked, in one building, attended to the ordinary business of her trade. Her clients came from the county seat and from 2 ranches south of it, and in later years from the new settlement at Rincon Wells, 12 miles west, where a different kind of town was beginning to establish itself with the energy of people who had not yet learned how a place could empty. Some of them asked her about Harlan. She told them what she knew, which was the factual account without embellishment, and she pointed to the ledgers on the shelf if they wanted to understand the mechanism, and most of them did not need to see the ledgers because the facts were clear enough on their own. One afternoon in the early spring of 1885, a rider she did not know stopped outside the mercantile, looked at the open shutters and the south light showing through, and called in to ask if there was water to spare. She brought him water in a tin cup. He drank it and asked her what the town was called, in the past or present tense, whichever applied. Harlan, she told him. Both tenses apply. He considered this and then rode on. She went back to her table and her work. Outside, in the thin desert light, the street held the quiet it had held for years, the kind of quiet that is not emptiness but rest, a place that has been through something long and difficult and has settled into what it actually is. The cottonwood that Celeste Varro had put in the ground on the corner lot was beginning, in the tentative manner of desert trees, to show green at the tips of its youngest branches. The fence post that had once marked the corner of that lot, that Nora could see from her south window every morning, stood in the same position it had held for years, unchanged, the wood silvered by the same process that had silvered the mercantile's own siding. The ledgers stood on their shelf above the cutting table, spines out, the stamped lettering faded now to near illegibility. Inside the third of them was Celeste Varro's receipt, kept in a tin box for 9 years, the paper slightly soft from that confinement, the ink still legible, the date and the amount and the name of the woman who had paid, and the name of the man who had received the payment and not recorded it. all present in the careful handwriting of a receipt that had been made in good faith and held in good faith until the day it was finally believed. If you have ever found something in a place the world had given up on, something that had been sitting there waiting for the right pair of hands, leave a word in the comments about what it was and where. The irons on Nora's stove were hot. She had a fitting in the morning, and there was yet good light remaining in the afternoon. She turned back to the cloth on her table, smoothed it with her palm against the grain first, as her mother had taught her, to feel where the resistance was, and then turned it the other way, and felt the cloth relent under her hand, and pressed the seam flat, working with the grain, the way it wants to go when you stop fighting it and simply follow where it leads.